while we ended up on the wrong side of both US and China by the 1970s, here was Pakistan, which was seen as a less virtuous foreign policy, actually was on the right side of both US and China.
Hi everyone. This week on Raja Mandala, in your column on the op-ed page of the Indian Express, you've taken an interesting turn, something we don't usually read about a lot, which is Pakistan's idea of strategic autonomy. That's how you start the piece. That in India we talk a lot about strategic economy, what is best for us, but so does every country. How you mentioned it in the piece, but if you could tell us again, what are some of the successes that Pakistan has had diplomatically and the way it's leveraged itself? What are some of its main, in terms of how it's managed to do that, and perhaps what's there for India to learn from that, from the past and even to the future?
I think there is, an image in our own foreign policy debate, which tends to be so self-referential that we seem to think there's some special virtues to our policy. While if you look at the broader world, I think the idea of strategic autonomy or maximizing your room for decision making is something everybody does. But under the constraints that each country has. So for years we've imagined, look, India is this great, country that follows an independent foreign policy. Well, Pakistan accepted alliances and somehow is diminished for that. But what I try to point out that Pakistan has been quite clever in the way it deals with alliances. I mentioned the fact that, for example, in the 1950s, Pakistan had no hesitation signing up to the anti-communist alliances that the US and UK were proposing, like the SEATO and the CENTO, that is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and the Central Treaty Organization. The first was for Southeast Asia, second was for the Middle East. And Pakistan also had a bilateral agreement with the United States, military security agreement. So for the West, it was about fighting communism. But Pakistan saw this as directed at India. So therefore, they didn't have any ideological commitment to fight communism. For them, it was using the West to balance India because they were smaller than India. And I give the example of the Bandung Conference, 1955 in Indonesia, Bandung, where Chow En Lai reaches out to the Pakistan Prime Minister, who on first day is very critical of China, and tells him, look, you and I have no quarrel. Look, my problem is with the US and its element. I have no issue with you, so we can be friends. And I have, that there are other things we can do together. And Pakistan seized the moment that they saw the fact that although at that time, India, China were best friends, that China could be a useful partner in balancing India. And that turned out to be a hugely, successful bet. And when US and China did not have diplomatic relations, Pakistan became a bridge eventually. So what seemed a contradiction, that is signing on to US alliances, which is fighting China, but opening up to China, and then Americans using Pakistan as a base to do secret diplomacy with China. So I think while we ended up on the wrong side of both US and China by the 1970s, here was Pakistan, which was seen as a less virtuous foreign policy, actually was on the right side of both US and China. Second is the example of the 80s, where Pakistan and the US was sponsoring the jihad against Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, and how Pakistan uses that moment to become a nuclear weapon power. Because just before the Russian invasion, Americans imposed nuclear sanctions. The day after the Russian invasion, they say, look, okay, Pakistan uses, General Zia-ul-Haq uses that to advance his own, nuclear weapons program. So this, and then now in the last 20 years, US needed Pakistan to fight Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But here was Pakistan, that got a lot of benefit, almost $30 billion of military economic assistance. But at the same time, what Pakistan did was to keep Taliban alive. So Taliban was nurtured and be ready to take charge of Pakistan today, of Afghanistan today. So this idea, somehow you get into an alliance and you are a servant of the other guy. That is the way we've debated alliances, strategic autonomy. Well, Pakistan case shows, look, there's always room to play. And it varies from circumstance to circumstance. So I think our debate then sees this as some kind of a fixed category. Somehow, if you have an alliance, you give up your autonomy. But Pakistan has shown it can navigate multiple contradictions, even while, between adversaries, but it can still make benefit out of it.
In the piece, you mention a series of reasons, some sort of shortfalls from the economy towards and Pakistan's domestic policy and politics, and how at this juncture it still has to do it again. That everyone should read the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com. It will be in the description wherever you're seeing this video. But there is another interesting, at this point, you mentioned it in the piece, that on the one hand, the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan, and Pakistan may see some kind of opportunity as the go-between for the Taliban in the US or the whatever future forms of government take place in Afghanistan. On the other hand, there's the South China Sea, where India is part of the Quad. It's getting closer to the US as a sort of bulwark against China in the region. How do you see Pakistan balancing it out, and Delhi? How do you see India playing its diplomatic role in that? Because if, say, the US goes back to, and like you're saying, there's some moves that are being made, there is some goodwill even now for the Pakistan military within the West, particularly in the US, given their old ties. How does that play out for India if say, Pakistan is once again an important player in Afghanistan for the West, their client? How does that play out for us?
I think the Pakistan's leverage is at the peak right now. That is, as the Americans withdraw, I mean, they would want to look reasonable, some kind of a government established, and Pakistan Taliban does not humiliate the West by defying the West and seizing Kabul by force. But it now looks like, just as Pakistan was never a pawn of the United States, the Taliban might not be a pawn of the Pakistanis either. That is, it is not clear whether Pakistan can actually deliver Taliban to do a peaceful deal, because the last 4 months, Taliban has refused to really implement an extended ceasefire, nor it is willing to join the Istanbul talks. So there you are, actually, but here is the paradox. Pakistan worries, look, Pakistan had the ideal situation where Americans are invested in Afghanistan. They need Pakistan to move their troops and equipment. Therefore, they'll keep paying Pakistan for it. But now, once they withdraw, once the Americans turn their back on Afghanistan and focus on the Indo-Pacific, which is what you're referring to, that the threat is no longer seen from minor terrorist groups, but from China, then Pakistan army worries that, look, its weight in Washington will decline. So that is a concern. And then they also don't want to get in the crossfire between US and China, because in the previous 50 years, Pakistan enjoyed good relations with both US and China. But now US and China are not on the same side. They're actually, the confrontation between them is going intense. So Pakistan has to navigate this new situation where it wants to keep its solid iron brother relationship with China. But at the same time, the Pakistani elite is really always been close to the West. They love London, they have large numbers in the US and Dubai. So they hold whatever, not that the Pakistani elite loves Chinese communism, but China is useful in balancing India, but their cultural, social connectivity is largely to the West. So they don't want to lose those connections. So I think that is the trick that Pakistan has to now navigate between US and China, and find way to use strategic autonomy, if you will, to develop a policy that will suit its national interest the best possible way.
So, final question, which is, there's an interesting thing which in the piece, again, I think everyone should read it because you develop the argument thoroughly there. But is it one of the things that has sort of held back Pakistan, apart from, of course, the fact that the economic disparity, just as it's grown between India and China on the one hand, on almost a similar scale as between Pakistan and India, and that is one major aspect of it. But the other is also a sort of, I don't know how to put it, either revanchist or this sort of an ideological tint to politics, which is bound to spill over to foreign policy. You cannot have you cannot say promote extremism, maybe for cynical reasons, not out of conviction, and then hope it goes away. In that same sense, do you see there's lessons for others in South Asia, including us, that there is a certain tendency to move backwards in domestic politics and the domestic political discourse? And that sooner or later will have an effect on the way you're even able to leverage your strategic autonomy and how to do it in the world.
No, exactly. You see, I think if you go back to the 50s, I mean, Pakistan was seen as a very progressive state, a moderate Islamic state. It was welcome in the councils of the West. It was part of the Western alliance system, and it was socially liberal within Pakistan. And it had huge amount of goodwill. And I think the economy in Pakistan did very well in the 50s and right into the mid 60s. And many saw Pakistan's future much better than India's, or for that matter, countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia, which are doing so well, Korea, for example, today. But what Pakistan squandered that advantage, I think by doing 2-3 things. I think one, it neglected its economic development. And that today its economy has gone down from the 90s. It is today 1/10 of the India's size. India's economy is around $3 trillion. Pakistan is around $300 billion. Its per capita income, because of high population growth rate and low economic growth rate, its per capita income today is half of that of Bangladesh. And then internally, it has unleashed these religious forces, which seemed a smart idea to put the Russians on the defensive, use it to put down the democratic forces, and to leverage extremist forces within the domestic politics. It worked for the Pakistan army very well, but today they're a burden for Pakistan. For example, on the blasphemy issue, here this group is demonstrating, repeatedly saying, look, throw the French ambassador out. Now, you know that you can't throw the French ambassador out, but the pressure is mounting from the extremist groups. And the EU 2 weeks ago passed a resolution saying, look, if you don't withdraw your blasphemy laws, we're going to remove your GSP preference. So I think Pakistan is going to come under that pressure that internally, what seemed a clever move 4 decades ago is now creating problems. Similarly, on the so-called Financial Action Task Force. For years, Pakistan can support jihad in India, in Afghanistan, and that it worked for Pakistan's foreign policy interests. But today, that same strategy brings in sanctions from the international community, which is constricting Pakistan's ability to borrow money and do a whole lot of financial sanctions. So I think that's where Pakistan is caught. But the broader point one is making, if you rely too much, and the other point we mentioned, Pakistan's obsession with Kashmir and dominating Afghanistan. You can't win those battles, but you can't retreat from those battles as well. I think that's the dilemma Pakistan has caught in. But the big point you made, asking, are there lessons for the rest of South Asia? That is, if we lose internal unity, internal coherence, in the name of mobilizing a religion, like which in Pakistan, while Islam was mobilized, it also created huge sectarian divide between Shia and the Sunni, discrimination against the Ahmadiyyas. So I think that creates, and then against the Christians, against the Hindu population. So I think, and that creates an international response as well. So I think for India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, for everyone, that look, we're all diverse societies. If we don't maintain internal coherence and try to leverage nationalism on the base of religion or other forms, that's going to weaken you internally and then create problems for you externally. So I think that problem, and then the question of pre-modern ideologies. Look here, India is debating whether allopathy, is vaccines good or not. Okay, all societies, there is some resistance. But you have someone who calls himself a Swamiji, he is openly campaigning against vaccination. When your only hope for getting over this crisis is vaccination, and the state finds it hard to deal with that. So I think these are the dangers that a state cannot cede its power to discipline any organization to a group, and you lose the capacity, then you become a prisoner of the extremist forces yourself.
Pakistan, despite the military, hasn't been able to put the genie back in the bottle, like you mentioned in the piece. That Bajwa has been trying to do this geoeconomics instead of geopolitics and all of these good words, but it's not an immediate hit. Despite his efforts, it doesn't seem to have been. Great, so thanks a lot, everyone. Read the piece, and we will see you next week with the next Raja Mandala. Thank you so much.